The roar of motorcycle engines shattered the quiet afternoon like thunder rolling through a calm sky. One by one, heavy bikes pulled into the dusty parking lot of the roadside diner, their chrome gleaming, their exhaust growling with intimidation. Conversations inside slowed, then stopped, forks paused mid-air. Everyone knew what that sound meant. The door swung open, and the bikers walked in as if they owned the place. Leather jackets, heavy boots, cold stares, loud laughter that demanded attention. They spread out across the diner, knocking chairs aside, claiming tables without asking. One of them slapped the counter with his palm and shouted for coffee, not caring who he disturbed. The air felt tense, thick with the kind of fear people learn to swallow quietly. At the far end of the diner, a single man sat alone. He wore simple clothes, nothing flashy. His jacket looked worn, his posture relaxed. A half-full cup of coffee sat in front of him, steam rising slowly. He didn't flinch when the bikers entered. He didn't look up. He simply took another calm sip, as if the noise around him didn't exist. That annoyed them. One biker noticed him and smirked. "Hey," he called out loudly, drawing attention. "You lost, old man." This place just turned private. Laughter erupted from the group. Heads turned. Phones subtly lifted. The man slowly placed his coffee cup down. Still calm, still silent. Another biker walked past and deliberately bumped his shoulder, sloshing coffee onto the table. "Oops," he sneered. "Didn't see you there." More laughter. Louder this time. The man finally looked up. His eyes were steady. No fear, no anger. Just quiet awareness. He wiped the spill with a napkin, stood up slowly, and pushed his chair in. That should have been the end of it. But the bikers weren't done. "Well, look at that," the leader said, stepping forward. "You gonna cry about it, or you gonna run?" The diner went completely silent. Even the kitchen noise faded. Everyone waited for the explosion, for shouting, for fists, for chaos. Instead, the man spoke calmly. "You should let me leave." The leader blinked, then laughed harder than anyone else. "Or what?" The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten, he didn't posture. He simply said, "Because this doesn't end the way you think it does." That was when the laughter stopped. The bikers exchanged looks. Annoyance replaced amusement. Chairs scraped the floor as they stood, slowly circling him. Someone whispered, "You got guts, I'll give you that." The man took one step toward the door, and that was the moment everyone in that diner realized something was very, very wrong. Because the calm in his face wasn't fear. It was certainty. What those bikers didn't know, what no one in that diner could have guessed, was that they had just picked the wrong man. The diner slowly returned to a low murmur after the initial shock, but the tension never left. The bikers spread themselves out like they were claiming territory, boots planted wide, leather creaking as they leaned back in their chairs. Their presence dominated the room. Nobody challenged them. Nobody ever did. The leader of the group sat front and center, arms crossed, eyes scanning the diner like a king inspecting his court. He enjoyed the silence he created. Power to him meant being louder, bigger, more feared than everyone else in the room. Every laugh from his crew reinforced that belief. Behind the counter, the waitress moved carefully, keeping her eyes down. She poured coffee with slightly shaking hands, trying not to draw attention. The cook in the back pretended to be busy, though his eyes kept flicking toward the dining area. Everyone was alert. Everyone was cautious. The man who had stood up moments earlier paused near the door, then calmly returned to his seat instead of leaving. He didn't look trapped. He looked patient. He adjusted his jacket and sat down as if he had all the time in the world. That confused them. Most people hurried away when given the chance. Most people avoided eye contact. This man didn't. He picked up his napkin again, wiped his hands slowly, and took another sip of his coffee as though the room hadn't changed at all. One biker leaned toward the leader and muttered, "Guy's either crazy or stupid." The leader smirked. "We'll find out." He stood up and walked over, boots heavy against the floor. "You didn't answer my question," he said. "You lost, or you just don't listen well." The man looked up calmly. His face was relaxed, unreadable. "I'm not lost," he replied, "and I listened just fine." That answer drew a few snickers, but the leader's smile tightened. "Then you should know when you're not welcome." "I do," the man said evenly. "I also know when someone's trying too hard." That did it. Chairs scraped as more bikers leaned in, surrounding the table loosely, forming a quiet circle. Not aggressive yet, just enough to remind him he was outnumbered. The waitress froze for a moment as she passed by, her eyes lingering on the man's face. Something about him felt familiar. She couldn't place it, but there was a calm confidence there she hadn't seen before. Not arrogance, not bravado, something deeper. The leader leaned closer. "You got a name, quiet guy." The man met his stare. "Steven." A few bikers shrugged. Just a name. No one connected it yet. Steven Seagal sat there like he had nowhere else to be. No entourage, no security, no signs of importance. Just a man in simple clothes, drinking diner coffee in silence. Steven, the leader repeated mockingly. You should have walked when you had the chance. Steven's voice didn't change. I still can. The leader laughed. Not anymore. Around them, customers shifted uncomfortably. Phones were lowered now. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It felt like something was building, something heavy. Steven glanced around the diner, taking everything in, the exits, the spacing, the people. His movements were subtle, unhurried. Anyone watching closely might have noticed that his calm wasn't accidental. It was practiced. He looked back at the leader. This doesn't have to get ugly. The leader shook his head. Too late for that. And just like that, the room held its breath, waiting to see who would make the first real move. The circle around the table tightened, not close enough to strike, but close enough to suffocate. Leather jackets brushed against one another. The low rumble of biker laughter faded into something sharper, more focused. This was no longer a joke. This was control. The leader placed both hands on the table and leaned forward, his shadow falling across Steven's coffee cup. You talk like you've got options, he said quietly. But look around. You don't. Steven didn't move. He didn't glance at the men surrounding him. His eyes stayed on the leader's face, steady and unreadable. Options don't disappear just because someone's loud, he replied. A biker to the left scoffed. Man's got a death wish. Another stepped closer, deliberately kicking Steven's chair leg. The chair jolted, but Steven's balance didn't change. That small detail went unnoticed by most, but not all. A few customers exchanged uneasy looks. This wasn't normal confidence. This was something else. The leader straightened up and gave a slow, mocking clap. Impressive, he said. You don't shake easy. Steven finally stood. The movement was unhurried, almost respectful. He pushed the chair in neatly, just as he had before. At eye level now, the height difference between him and the leader seemed to irritate the bikers more than intimidate him. I'm asking you one last time, Steven said. Let me walk out. Silence. Then laughter exploded, louder than before. One biker wiped tears from his eyes. You hear that? He's polite. The leader's smile vanished. You don't get to make requests. He nodded once. That was all it took. A biker reached out and grabbed Steven's jacket, fingers curling into the worn fabric. The room froze. Someone gasped. A plate shattered in the kitchen. Steven looked down at the hand on his chest. Then he looked back up. Slowly, calmly, he placed his own hand over the biker's wrist, not forceful, not aggressive. Just contact. Don't, he said. The biker smirked and tightened his grip. Or what? Steven exhaled quietly and removed the hand, not by yanking it away, but by turning it, redirecting the pressure, guiding it aside with minimal effort. The biker stumbled half a step back, surprise flashing across his face. The latter stopped instantly. What the hell? Someone muttered. Steven took a small step back, creating space. He wasn't advancing. He wasn't threatening. But the message was clear. The leader's jaw tightened. You think that little trick scares us? No, Steven replied. I think what comes next should. The biker shifted. Boots' shoulders squared. The circle closed again, tighter this time. Not chaotic, controlled. They were preparing. Steven's gaze moved calmly from face to face. He wasn't counting them out of fear. He was measuring distance. Timing movement. Anyone watching closely might have noticed how still he was compared to them, how centered. You should have stayed seated, the leader said. No, you've embarrassed my guy. Steven shook his head slightly. He embarrassed himself. That was enough. The leader raised his hand, ready to signal the attack. Before he could drop it, Steven spoke again, quietly but firmly. If you do this, he said, someone here gets seriously hurt. The leader laughed, but there was hesitation now. Yeah, who? Steven met his eyes. Not me. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across the leader's face. Not fear, confusion. The kind that creeps in when a situation isn't going according to script. A biker lunged forward impulsively, breaking formation. Steven moved, not fast, not flashy, just precise. He stepped aside, guided the biker's momentum past him, and the man stumbled hard into the table, knocking it over with a crash. Coffee spilled across the floor. Chairs clattered. People shouted. Steven didn't follow up. He didn't strike again. He simply stepped back into place. The message landed harder than any punch. The diner erupted into chaos, customers scrambling away, phones raised again, fear mixing with awe. The bikers hesitated now, no longer laughing, no longer confident. Steven stood in the center of it all, breathing steady, voice calm. This is your last warning, he said. No one moved. And that silence, heavy, charged, dangerous, was far more threatening than the noise that had come before. For several long seconds, no one moved. The diner felt frozen in time, as if everyone inside was afraid that even breathing too loudly might shatter the fragile pause hanging in the air. The biker who had crashed into the table groaned as he pushed himself up, his confidence shaken along with his balance. Coffee dripped from the edge of the overturned table, splashing onto the floor in slow, steady drops that echoed in the silence. The leader's raised hand never came down. His eyes stayed locked on Steven, searching for something, fear, hesitation, doubt. He found none. What unsettled him most wasn't the brief movement that had sent his man stumbling. It was what came after. Steven hadn't pressed the advantage. He hadn't attacked. He hadn't even changed his expression. That wasn't how fights worked, not in the leader's world. Around them, the bikers shifted uneasily. One adjusted his jacket. Another cracked his knuckles, then stopped unsure. They were used to people backing down, panicking, begging. They weren't used to restraint. Steven slowly bent down and picked up the fallen chair, setting it upright. The simple, ordinary action cut through the tension like a blade. He straightened the table, pushed it back into place, and glanced at the spilled coffee. "Sorry about the mess," he said calmly, not to the bikers but to the room. The waitress stared at him, stunned. No one had ever apologized in the middle of something like this. The leader scoffed, trying to regain control. "You think that little move means something?" he said loudly, though his voice lacked the certainty it had before. "You think one stumble changes anything?" Steven met his stare. "It already has." The words landed quietly, but they spread through the room. The bikers felt it. So did the customers. Something had shifted, not violently, not dramatically, but undeniably. Steven took a step back, then another, creating distance between himself and the circle. He wasn't retreating in fear. He was disengaging. "I'm leaving now," he said. "No more warnings." The leader laughed again, but it sounded forced. "You walk when I say you walk." Steven didn't respond. He turned his back on them. Gasps rippled through the diner. Turning away from armed, angry bikers wasn't brave. It was reckless, or confident. Steven walked toward the door at an unhurried pace. His footsteps were steady, measured. Behind him, the bikers exchanged looks, waiting for the leader's signal. The moment stretched. Everyone expected chaos, an attack from behind, a tackle, something brutal and sudden. It never came. The leader's hand remained frozen at his side. Steven reached the door and pushed it open. Sunlight flooded in, momentarily blinding those inside. He stepped outside, letting the door swing shut behind him with a soft chime. Silence followed. The bikers stood there, stunned, as if they'd just watched someone walk away from an explosion that never happened. One of them finally broke the quiet. "Boss, we just letting him go." The leader didn't answer immediately. His jaw clenched. Something about the way Steven had left, without looking back, without running, scratched at his pride. "Fine," he muttered. "Let him walk." The tension slowly drained from the room, replaced by nervous chatter. Customers whispered. Phones came back out, replaying what they'd just captured. The waitress exhaled shakily and leaned against the counter. Then a strange sound cut through the noise. Outside. Engines turning over. The bikers perked up instantly. Smirks returned. The leader straightened. "There we go," he said. "Let's go." They pushed past chairs and headed for the door, their confidence beginning to rebuild. The leader stepped outside first and stopped dead. One by one, the others followed, only to freeze in place. Their bikes sat exactly where they'd left them. Silent. A biker twisted his ignition harder, nothing. Another tried his starter, then cursed. One by one, engines refused to turn over. Panic crept in, replacing bravado. "What the hell?" Someone snapped. "These were fine." The leader's eyes scanned the lot, and then he saw Steven standing across the street, calm as ever, watching them. Steven raised his voice just enough to carry. "I told you," he said evenly. "This wouldn't end the way you thought." A chill ran through the group. No threats, no insults. Just truth. And in that moment, as confusion turned to unease, the bikers realized something far more frightening than violence had just entered the equation. They had lost control, without a single punch thrown. The parking lot felt unnaturally quiet. No engines. No laughter. Just the clicking of cooling metal and the distant sound of traffic moving freely down the highway, everyone else going somewhere while the bikers stood frozen in place. One of them tried his bike again, twisting the throttle harder this time. The engine coughed once, then died. He slammed his fist against the handlebar. "This is bulls." "Stop," the leader snapped. He hadn't taken his eyes off Steven. Across the street, Steven stood with his hands relaxed at his sides, the afternoon sun casting long shadows behind him. He hadn't moved closer. He hadn't moved away. He looked like a man waiting patiently for a light to change. The leader stepped forward a half pace. "What did you do?" he demanded. Steven's voice carried calmly across the distance. "Nothing you didn't make possible." The bikers exchanged looks, confusion mixing with irritation. One of them muttered, "He's bluffing." Steven shook his head slightly. "No, I'm finished." That only deepened the unease. The diner door opened behind them, and a few customers cautiously stepped out, drawn by curiosity. Phones were back up, recording. The waitress stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth, eyes locked on Steven like she was finally putting pieces together. The leader took another step forward. "You think you're smarter than us?" Steven didn't answer right away. He glanced at the bikes, then back at the men. "I think you rely too much on noise," he said, "and not enough on awareness." Before the leader could respond, a police cruiser pulled into the lot, then another. Red and blue lights flashed, reflecting off chrome and leather. Conversations stopped instantly. A few bikers stiffened, hands instinctively moving away from their pockets. The first officer stepped out, scanning the scene with a practiced eye. "Everything okay here?" The leader forced a smile. "Yeah, just a misunderstanding." The officer's gaze shifted past him, to Steven. Recognition flickered across his face. He straightened slightly. "Sir," he said, nodding respectfully. "Good to see you." That single gesture hit harder than anything else that day. The leader turned slowly. "You know him?" The officer didn't look away from Steven.
"Yes," he said. "We do."
Another car arrived, then a plain black SUV. Its doors opened, and two men in suits stepped out, moving with purpose. They weren't rushing. They weren't panicked. They walked like people who knew exactly where they were supposed to be. They approached Steven and stopped a few feet away. "Mr. Seagal," one of them said. "We've been trying to reach you." The name landed like a drop plate. A ripple ran through the bikers. Someone whispered it under their breath. Someone else sucked in a sharp breath. The leader's face drained of color. Steven nodded slightly. "I needed a moment." The man in the suit glanced at the bikes, the officers, the small crowd. "It seems you found one." The officer turned to the bikers, his tone changing. "Gentlemen, I'm going to need you to step back from the vehicles." "What?" The leader snapped. "Why?" "Because," the officer replied evenly, "this situation is no longer what you think it is." The second suited man spoke up. "Those bikes aren't malfunctioning. They were disabled." The leader's voice rose. "By who?" The man looked at Steven. "By someone who's trained people like me for decades," he said calmly. "Someone who understands control without chaos." Silence spread again, thicker than before. The waitress stepped forward, her voice trembling. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew I recognized him." Steven finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't come here looking for trouble," he said. "I came for coffee." The absurd simplicity of the statement made it worse. The leader swallowed hard. "You set us up." Steven met his eyes. "You did that yourselves." The officer folded his arms. "We've had reports about this group harassing people along the highway," he said. "Today just made things very clear." The bikers started talking at once, denials, excuses, anger, but none of it landed. The confidence they'd walked in with was gone, replaced by the realization that they'd crossed paths with someone operating on an entirely different level. Steven turned slightly toward the leader. "I warned you," he said quietly. "More than once." The leader opened his mouth, then closed it, pride warred with survival. Finally, his shoulders sagged. "What do you want?" he asked. Steven didn't hesitate. "For you to leave," he said, "and to remember this feeling the next time you think strength comes from intimidation." The suited man nodded toward the officers. "We'll handle the rest." As the bikers were directed away from their bikes, frustration boiling just beneath the surface, the crowd began to murmur. Phones captured every angle. Whispers turned into awe. Steven turned back toward the diner, then stopped. He looked at the waitress. "Sorry again about the mess," he said. She shook her head, eyes wide. "Thank you," she replied. Steven walked away from the lot, calm as ever, while behind him the sound of authority replaced the roar of engines. And only then did the full truth settle in. This had never been a fight. It had been a lesson. The atmosphere in the parking lot had completely changed. What had once felt like a stage for intimidation now felt like a place of quiet accountability. The bikers stood apart from one another, no longer a unified force. Without their engines, without their noise, they looked small or ordinary. The illusion of dominance had cracked, and everyone could see what was underneath. The officers moved calmly, professionally, asking questions, checking IDs, documenting what had happened. No one was shouting anymore. No one was laughing. The leader stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the ground, replaying every moment in his head. Each insult, each laugh, each warning he had ignored. Steven stood a short distance away, not watching closely, not supervising. He leaned lightly against a post, eyes drifting toward the road. His posture wasn't triumphant. It wasn't satisfied. It was neutral, like a man waiting for a task to finish. One of the officers approached him. "We'll need a brief statement," he said respectfully. "Just to close things out." Steven nodded. "Of course." As they spoke quietly, the leader glanced over. He hesitated, then slowly walked closer, stopping a few steps away. For a long moment, he said nothing. "I didn't know," he finally muttered. Steven looked at him, expression calm. "That's not an excuse," he replied gently. "That's the point." The words weren't sharp. They weren't loud, but they cut deeper than any insult could have. The leader clenched his jaw. "We thought you were just some guy." Steven nodded once. "Exactly." Silence settled between them. Not awkward, heavy, the kind that forces reflection. "You could have hurt us," the leader said quietly. Steven shook his head. "I didn't need to." The leader exhaled slowly, shoulders sagging. "You humiliated us." Steven met his eyes. "No," he said. "You did that yourselves. I just didn't stop you." That was when it fully hit. This wasn't about strength. It wasn't about winning. It was about restraint, about choosing not to escalate when escalation was expected, about letting arrogance collapse under its own weight. Nearby, the waitress stood with the cook and a few customers, watching the exchange. Her hands were still trembling slightly, but her eyes were clear now. She hadn't seen violence. She had seen control. And that, somehow, felt more powerful. The officers finished their checks. One of them addressed the bikers. "You're free to go," he said firmly. "But not today. Tow trucks are on the way. You'll sort this out later." A few bikers protested weakly, but their voices lacked conviction. They knew how close they'd come to things ending far worse. As the group was escorted away from the bikes, the leader stopped again and looked back at Steven. "You could have destroyed us," he said. "Why didn't you?" Steven thought for a moment. "Because that wouldn't teach you anything," he replied. The leader nodded slowly, as if committing the answer to memory, then turned and walked away. The crowd began to disperse. Phones lowered. Conversations resumed, quieter now, reflective. The diner door opened, and the familiar smell of coffee drifted back into the air. The waitress stepped forward hesitantly. "Sirt." Steven turned. She smiled, nervous but sincere. "Your coffee's on the house. Forever if you want." A faint smile touched Steven's face. "Thank you," he said. "But I think I've had enough for one day." She laughed softly, relief spilling through the sound. The suited men approached again. "Your ride is ready," one of them said, gesturing toward the SUV. Steven nodded. Before leaving, he glanced back at the diner. At the ordinary building, the ordinary people, the place that had almost become something very different. "Take care of each other," he said quietly. Then he walked away. As the SUV pulled onto the road and disappeared into traffic, the parking lot returned to stillness. Tow trucks arrived. Officers finished their paperwork. Life resumed. But something lingered. Inside the diner, customers talked in hushed voices, replaying the moment again and again, not the near fight, but the calm. The way power had entered the room without announcing itself. The way it had left without demanding applause. The waitress wiped down the counter, her hands steady now. She looked out the window one last time and shook her head in disbelief. Quiet strength, she murmured to herself. Outside, the leader of the biker group sat on the curb staring at his boots. The noise that usually filled his head was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar. Awareness. For the first time in a long while, he understood that fear wasn't respect, and control didn't come from intimidation. It came from knowing when not to act. And that lesson, learned without a single punch thrown, would follow him far longer than any bruise ever could. The road stretched on, endless and indifferent. Steven was already gone. But what he left behind was unmistakable. A reminder that true power doesn't need permission, doesn't seek attention, and doesn't prove itself through destruction. It simply chooses restraint. And sometimes that choice changes everything. Long after the parking lot cleared and the diner returned to its familiar rhythm, the story lingered. People would talk about it for days, not with excitement but with reflection. Not about fists or broken bones, but about something far rarer. Control. Restraint. A kind of strength that didn't announce itself or demand to be seen. What happened that day wasn't a victory in the way most people understand victory. No one stood over another. No one claimed dominance. There was no cheering crowd, no dramatic ending. And yet, everyone who witnessed it felt the weight of it settle deep inside them. Because the truth is, respect doesn't begin with fear. Too often, people confuse volume with authority. They think the loudest voice wins, that intimidation equals power, that stepping on others is how you stand taller. But what unfolded in that diner exposed a deeper reality, one most people never stop to consider. True power doesn't rush. True power doesn't react. True power doesn't need to prove itself. The bikers came in believing control was something you take. They believed strength meant dominance, that silence was weakness, and that calm was surrender. They had learned those lessons over years of noise and confrontation. And in a matter of minutes, every one of those beliefs collapsed. Not because someone overpowered them, but because someone refused to play their game. That's what made the moment unforgettable. Anyone can escalate. Anyone can shout louder, threaten harder, strike faster. That's easy. That's instinct. But restraint, that requires awareness, discipline, confidence so solid it doesn't crack under pressure. The calm presence in that diner wasn't accidental. It wasn't luck. It was the result of understanding something most people never learn, that you don't owe chaos your participation. Sometimes the strongest response is silence. Sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one who isn't trying to be. The customers who witnessed it walked away changed. Some realized how quickly they judge based on appearance. Others reflected on moments they'd stayed quiet when they should have spoken, or spoken when silence would have been wiser. Even the bikers themselves, whether they admitted it or not, carried that lesson with them. Because humiliation fades, anger fades, but awareness lingers. Respect isn't something you turn on when it's convenient. It's not reserved for people you admire or fear. It's something you show before you know who someone is. Because one day, the person you dismiss might be the one who defines the moment. That's the quiet truth at the heart of this story. Strength doesn't always look strong. Wisdom doesn't always look impressive. And the most powerful people in the room often look like the least threatening, until it matters. What made this moment powerful wasn't what happened. It was what didn't happen. No unnecessary violence, no escalation, no ego-driven destruction. Just a clear line drawn and held. In a world that rewards loud reactions and dramatic clashes, restraint can feel invisible. But invisibility doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it means mastery. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to think about why. Was it the tension? The surprise? Or was it the reminder that you don't have to mirror disrespect to overcome it? More stories like this are coming. Stories about quiet strength, unexpected lessons, and moments that challenge how we define power and respect. Tell us in the comments which part stayed with you the most and why. Your feedback helps shape what we bring next. And if you believe humility is real strength, type respect below. Until next time, stay calm, stay aware, and remember, the strongest people rarely need to show it.